August 17, 1943. 1,215 hours. The skies above Schweinfurt, Germany. Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpff stood at the observation post of Luftwaffe Command Center 3, watching what should have been impossible. Through his Zeiss binoculars, he counted them, wave after wave of four-engine bombers stretching across the horizon like a silver river flowing through the clouds. "Mein Gott," he whispered to his adjutant. "They're not even trying to hide anymore." What the German High Command witnessed that day wasn't just an air raid. It was the visible manifestation of industrial might so overwhelming that it would rewrite every assumption about modern warfare. The Americans were flying 2,000 bombers over the Third Reich daily, and the implications were about to shatter Germany's confidence in ultimate victory. The transformation had begun 18 months earlier, though German military intelligence failed to grasp its significance. On January 27, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force conducted its first bombing raid on German soil, targeting the U-boat facilities at Wilhelmshaven with just 64 B-17 Flying Fortresses. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had laughed when reading the initial intelligence reports at his hunting lodge in Skorfjord. 64 bombers, he told his staff officers over cognac that evening. The Luftwaffe loses more aircraft than that in a month of operations over Russia. This is what they call strategic bombing? The mathematics seemed to support German confidence. The Third Reich's intelligence service, the Abwehr, calculated that American aircraft production, even with their vaunted industrial capacity, could not possibly sustain the losses required for sustained daylight bombing. Their analysts had studied the RAF's experience. British Bomber Command had abandoned daylight operations in 1940 after suffering catastrophic losses, sometimes exceeding 10% per mission. The Germans assumed the Americans would learn the same lesson, that daylight precision bombing was a theory that would die upon contact with German fighter defenses. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, had prepared detailed defensive plans based on proven tactics. His fighter wings had destroyed hundreds of Allied bombers over the previous 3 years. The formula was simple: concentrate fighters at the bomber stream's most vulnerable points, exploit the gaps in defensive fire, and inflict unsustainable losses. A 5% loss rate would ground any air force within months. A 10% loss rate would achieve this within weeks. But by summer 1943, something unprecedented was occurring in the skies over Germany. On July 24, Luftwaffe radar stations detected a formation approaching Hamburg that required 3 separate controllers to count. The initial report estimated 350 bombers. Galland's headquarters thought this was an error, perhaps double counting due to radar overlap. It wasn't an error. The Americans had sent 353 B-17s to Hamburg, supported by another 252 bombers targeting other objectives. Total, 605 heavy bombers in a single day. 2 weeks later, on August 12, the numbers had grown again. Schweinfurt and Regensburg simultaneously, 376 bombers, the largest American raid yet conducted. German fighters inflicted severe losses, 60 bombers destroyed, a 16% loss rate that should have been devastating. Galland's staff calculated that at such attrition rates, the American bomber force would be destroyed within 3 months. They prepared reports for Göring predicting the imminent collapse of the American daylight bombing campaign. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of decreasing, the bomber numbers increased. September brought raids of 400 bombers. October saw missions with 500. By December 1943, the impossible had become routine, 600 to 700 bombers appearing over German cities with mechanical regularity. The Americans were not being ground down by losses. They were growing stronger. Somewhere across the Atlantic, American factories were producing bombers faster than German fighters could destroy them, replacing losses and expanding the fleet simultaneously. January 11, 1944, 0845 hours. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Berlin. General der Flieger Joseph Kamhuber entered the morning briefing carrying a folder that would force the German High Command to confront an unbearable truth. The previous day, American bombers had struck targets across Germany in numbers that defied belief: 663 heavy bombers over Brunswick, Halberstadt, and Ostersleben, escorted by 521 fighters. This wasn't an exceptional maximum effort. It was becoming standard. Kamhuber opened his folder and began reading production figures that his intelligence staff had compiled from multiple sources: captured documents, neutral country observers, and reconnaissance photographs of American aircraft factories. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "the Americans are producing 4,000 heavy bombers per month. Not per year. Per month." The room fell silent. Someone asked him to repeat the number, certain they had misheard. Kamhuber repeated it slowly: 4,000 heavy bombers. Monthly production. B-17s and B-24s combined. The implications were staggering. German aircraft production, despite Albert Speer's reforms and the mobilization of slave labor, had reached 2,200 aircraft of all types per month: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, trainers, everything combined. The Americans were producing nearly twice that number in heavy bombers alone, not counting fighters, medium bombers, or any other aircraft types. One category of American production exceeded Germany's entire aviation industry output. But the numbers became truly incomprehensible when Kamhuber presented the complete picture. American factories were simultaneously producing thousands of fighters, thousands of medium bombers, thousands of transport aircraft, and thousands of training aircraft. Total American aircraft production for 1943, 85,898 aircraft. German production for the same period, 24,807 aircraft. The Americans were building aircraft at a rate 3.5 times greater than Germany's maximum capacity. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of Wehrmacht operations, demanded verification. Surely these figures were American propaganda, inflated numbers designed to damage German morale. Kamhuber had anticipated this skepticism. He presented reconnaissance photographs of American aircraft factories. The Boeing plant in Seattle covered 1.6 million square feet, larger than many German cities. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford Motor Company specifically to manufacture B-24 Liberators, stretched for nearly a mile. At peak production, Willow Run produced one complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. German industry required approximately 55,000 man-hours to build a bomber. The Americans had reduced this to approximately 18,000 man-hours through assembly line techniques. The briefing continued with even more disturbing data. American bomber production was supported by virtually unlimited resources. Strategic materials that Germany desperately conserved, aluminum, copper, rubber, high-octane aviation fuel, flowed into American factories in quantities that German planners considered wasteful. A single B-17 Flying Fortress required approximately 13,000 kilograms of aluminum. American factories were producing 600 to 700 B-17s monthly, consuming nearly 9 million kilograms of aluminum just for one bomber type. Germany's entire monthly aluminum production was approximately 40 million kilograms, supporting all military and civilian needs. The Americans were using a quarter of Germany's total aluminum production on a single aircraft model, while simultaneously producing dozens of other aluminum-intensive weapons systems. February 20, 1944, marked what German military historians would later call Die große Woche, Big Week. The name was grimly ironic, given what it represented for the Luftwaffe. American bombers launched coordinated strikes against German aircraft production facilities with a force concentration that paralyzed defensive responses. On that single day, 941 American heavy bombers struck targets across Germany simultaneously. Supporting them were 679 escort fighters, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and the new P-51 Mustangs that could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland watched his carefully constructed fighter defense system collapse under the weight of numbers it had never been designed to counter. His fighter wings achieved remarkable individual victories: 141 American bombers destroyed during Big Week, along with 28 fighters. In previous campaigns, such losses would have been catastrophic for the attackers. But the Americans returned the next day with barely diminished numbers. And the day after that. And the day after that. For 6 consecutive days, between 800 and 1,000 American bombers struck German targets while German fighter strength bled away at a rate that could not be sustained. The mathematics had become impossible. German fighter production could deliver approximately 1,000 single-engine fighters per month. Pilot training schools, already compressed to dangerous minimums, graduated roughly 800 pilots monthly. But combat losses during Big Week alone exceeded 300 fighters with their pilots, irreplaceable experienced men whose skills required years to develop. The Americans lost more aircraft in absolute numbers, but their replacement pipeline was inexhaustible. Every German pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every German aircraft destroyed represented a gap that would never be filled. By March 1944, the daily routine had become surreal. Luftwaffe radar operators began their shifts knowing they would detect formations of 500 to 700 bombers. Fighter controllers scrambled wings knowing they were outnumbered 5 to 1 or worse. German pilots climbed to intercept knowing that even successful missions, even killing 5 or 6 bombers, meant nothing against the endless stream that would return tomorrow. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a fighter ace with 176 victories, recorded in his diary on March 15, "Today we destroyed 11 American bombers over Brunswick. A successful mission by any previous standard. But tonight I counted the vapor trails of the returning formations. There must have been 600 bombers that survived our attacks. Tomorrow there will be 700. We are trying to empty the ocean with a bucket." The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was devastating. Luftwaffe combat reports from spring 1944 documented a phenomenon never before seen: experienced pilots suffering mental breakdown not from fear of death but from the futility of their sacrifice. They were achieving victories that would have been celebrated as heroic in 1940 or 1941, but those victories meant nothing when the enemy could absorb unlimited losses and return stronger. Intelligence reports confirmed what pilots saw with their own eyes: American air bases in England were expanding. Captured American airmen talked freely about new bomb groups arriving from the United States. The 8th Air Force had grown from 185 heavy bombers in January 1943 to over 2,000 by March 1944. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, had added another 1,000 heavy bombers. Combined, American bomber forces in Europe could now launch 3,000 aircraft in coordinated strikes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. April 24, 1944, 1,340 hours. Führerhauptquartier Berghof, Obersalzberg. The scene inside Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat conference room was one of barely controlled desperation. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had been summoned to explain why American bombers were flying over German cities with what appeared to be complete impunity. The numbers presented that morning were undeniable. April had seen 21 days of major American bombing operations. On 12 of those days, more than 700 bombers had struck German targets. The Luftwaffe had been unable to prevent a single major raid. Göring, his confidence from 1943 completely evaporated, presented what amounted to a confession of systemic failure. Mein Führer, he began carefully, we are not fighting an air force. We are fighting an aerial manifestation of American industrial production that exceeds anything in military history. He presented figures that his staff had compiled with meticulous German precision. In April alone, American bombers had dropped 36,000 tons of explosives on German targets. For context, the Luftwaffe's entire bombardment of Britain during the 1940 Blitz had totaled approximately 41,000 tons over 8 months. The Americans were now delivering nearly that tonnage monthly, and the rate was increasing. But the true revelation came when Göring presented comparative loss rates. During April, the Luftwaffe had shot down 409 American heavy bombers, a number that in previous wars would have represented complete victory. But American bomber strength over Europe had actually increased during the same month by approximately 150 aircraft. The Americans were absorbing losses that would have annihilated any other air force and simultaneously expanding their operational fleet. "They are producing bombers faster than we can destroy them," Göring stated flatly. "And they are training crews faster than we can kill them." General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, also present at the briefing, provided the fighter pilot's perspective. His units were achieving kill ratios that should have been decisive. For every German fighter lost, they destroyed 2 to 3 American bombers. But these tactical victories were strategically meaningless. The Americans accepted the exchange rate because they could afford it indefinitely. Germany could not. His fighter force was being systematically destroyed through attrition, losing irreplaceable experienced pilots while the American bomber stream grew stronger daily. Galland presented his own calculations that revealed the mathematical certainty of defeat. German fighter pilot training required approximately 18 months to produce a minimally competent combat pilot. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots at a rate that exceeded the training pipeline's capacity by approximately 40%. Every month, the average experience level of German fighter pilots decreased while the number of veteran American bomber crews, men who had survived 10, 15, or 20 missions, increased proportionally. The economic dimension was equally devastating. Each American B-17 Flying Fortress cost approximately $238,000 to produce, expensive by any measure. But Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, had calculated that defending against these bombers cost Germany far more. Each bomber shot down required the expenditure of approximately 3,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 500 rounds of 30mm ammunition, countless rockets, and most critically, one fighter sortie with its associated fuel, maintenance, and pilot risk. The fighter and fuel consumed defending against a single bomber often cost more than the bomber itself. And when German fighters failed to intercept, the bombers destroyed factories, refineries, and infrastructure worth millions of Reichsmarks. Speer delivered the most damning assessment. American bombing had forced Germany to divert approximately 30% of artillery production to anti-aircraft guns. 2 million workers were engaged in air raid defense, repair, and dispersal activities, 2 million workers who could have been producing tanks, aircraft, or ammunition for the Eastern Front. The Americans had achieved what German planners considered impossible. They had forced Germany to dedicate enormous resources to defending the homeland while simultaneously fighting massive ground campaigns on multiple fronts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. May 12, 1944, 0920 hours. The day that German strategists later identified as the operational death of the Luftwaffe began with radar stations detecting an incoming formation so large that operators initially dismissed their readings as equipment malfunction. They were not malfunctioning. The United States Army Air Forces had launched 935 heavy bombers toward targets across Germany, escorted by 826 fighters. The defensive response illustrated how completely the German fighter force had been overwhelmed. Luftwaffe fighter controllers could scramble only 428 fighters to intercept, outnumbered nearly 4 to 1 by American fighters alone, before even considering the defensive armament of the bombers themselves. The battle that followed was less a combat engagement than a systematic destruction of German air power. The Americans lost 46 bombers and 10 fighters. The Luftwaffe lost 65 fighters with their pilots, men who represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience. More critically, the bombers reached their targets virtually unopposed, delivering concentrated strikes against synthetic oil facilities that Germany's war machine absolutely required. The synthetic oil campaign that began in earnest that May represented strategic bombing achieving its theoretical maximum effectiveness. Germany's natural oil resources were negligible. The war effort depended entirely on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline through complex chemical processes. These plants were large, fixed, vulnerable targets that could not be dispersed or hidden. American intelligence had identified 27 critical synthetic oil facilities. Beginning in May 1944, American bombers struck these targets with relentless precision. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, reviewing damage reports on May 29, confronted a crisis that threatened to paralyze German military operations. Synthetic fuel production had dropped 35% in just 3 weeks of concentrated bombing. Tank divisions were receiving 30% less fuel than operational minimums. The Luftwaffe's fuel allocation had been cut by 40%, forcing fighter units to reduce training flights to preserve fuel for combat operations. This created a death spiral. Reduced training produced less capable pilots, who died more quickly in combat, requiring more replacement pilots who received even less training due to fuel shortages. The Americans, meanwhile, demonstrated industrial might that German planners found incomprehensible. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, American bombers continued their systematic destruction of German industry without any reduction in operational tempo. D-Day required the largest amphibious assault in history, involving thousands of aircraft in direct support. Yet the strategic bombing campaign against German industry continued unabated. The Americans were conducting 2 massive air campaigns simultaneously: direct tactical support for ground forces in France and strategic bombardment of German industrial capacity, operations that should have been mutually exclusive given limited resources. German intelligence officers analyzing American logistics capabilities reached conclusions that seemed fantastic but were undeniably true. The United States was supplying fuel, ammunition, and spare parts for strategic bombing operations in Europe while simultaneously supporting the largest amphibious invasion in history, fighting a naval war across the Pacific, supplying Soviet forces through Lend-Lease, and maintaining normal civilian economic activity. The tonnage of supplies flowing across the Atlantic exceeded the entire German transportation network's capacity. By late June 1944, the daily reality of German military operations had become surreal. Each morning brought radar detection of 700 to 1,000 American bombers. Each afternoon brought damage reports from industries that Germany could not function without. Each evening brought casualty lists of fighter pilots whose loss could not be replaced. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated in a climactic battle. It had been systematically ground down by an opponent who could absorb any losses Germany inflicted while simultaneously expanding their operational capacity. Oberst Hajo Hermann, who commanded night fighter operations, recorded in his report dated June 25, "We have lost air superiority. We have lost the ability to contest American bomber formations. We have lost the industrial capacity to replace our losses. Most critically, we have lost time. The Americans can continue this indefinitely. We cannot." July 7, 1944, 1150 hours. Reichsministerium für Rüstung und Kriegsproduktion, Berlin. Albert Speer stood before a large wall map of Germany covered in red markers indicating damaged or destroyed industrial facilities. Each red marker represented not just physical destruction but the severing of industrial connections that Germany's war economy required. "Gentlemen," he told the assembled industrial directors, "we are witnessing the systematic deconstruction of German industrial capacity by an opponent who understands modern economic warfare better than we anticipated possible." The numbers Speer presented documented an industrial catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. Aviation fuel production had collapsed from 175,000 tons in April to 52,000 tons in June, a 70% reduction in 8 weeks. Ball bearing production, critical for virtually all military equipment, had declined 67%. Locomotive production had fallen 35%. Synthetic rubber production was down 60%. These were not random losses from scattered bombing. They represented methodical targeting of industrial bottlenecks that American analysts had identified as critical to German military capability. But the true sophistication of American strategic bombing became apparent when examining second and third-order effects. The Americans bombed ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, forcing Germany to disperse production to smaller facilities. Then American bombers struck the transportation network connecting these dispersed facilities, paralyzing the distribution system. They bombed synthetic fuel plants, reducing available gasoline. Then they bombed the electric power plants that supplied the synthetic fuel facilities, ensuring repairs could not restore production. Every German adaptation was met with American countermoves that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of industrial interdependencies. General Major Dietrich Peltz, assigned to analyze American bombing effectiveness, presented findings that illustrated the exponential nature of industrial collapse. When Americans destroyed 30% of synthetic fuel production, the actual impact on military operations was not 30%. It was closer to 60% because reduced fuel meant reduced transportation capacity, which meant slower repairs, which meant longer downtimes, which compounded the original damage. American bombers were creating cascading failures throughout German industry. The psychological impact on German industrial workers paralleled the effect on fighter pilots. Workers rebuilt factories only to have them destroyed again weeks later. They dispersed production into forests and caves, only to have American bombers find and destroy the dispersed facilities. The futility was crushing morale more effectively than the bombs destroyed machinery. Absenteeism in critical war industries had increased 40% since January. This was not sabotage, it was exhaustion and despair. By August 1944, the daily routine of strategic bombing had achieved a terrible regularity. Morning reconnaissance flights mapped German targets. By noon, 800 to 1,200 bombers crossed the Reich's borders. Afternoon brought the sound of air raid sirens that no longer induced panic because they had become constant background noise. Evening brought damage assessment teams counting the cost of another day's destruction. Night brought no respite, RAF Bomber Command ensured round-the-clock bombardment. German defensive efforts had become purely symbolic. Luftwaffe fighter units still scrambled to intercept bomber formations, but combat reports revealed the desperation. Veteran pilots with minimal training flew alongside teenagers with essentially no training against bomber streams escorted by fighters that now outnumbered German interceptors 3-1. The kill rates achieved by German fighters had actually improved, experienced pilots were achieving remarkable victories. But these individual heroics meant nothing against industrial scale that could absorb unlimited losses. The economic data compiled by Speer's ministry revealed the mathematical certainty of defeat. American bombing had forced Germany to allocate resources to air defense that exceeded the cost of the bombing damage itself. The 8,876 heavy anti-aircraft guns defending German cities required production capacity that could have built 45,000 additional tanks. The 2 million workers assigned to air defense tasks represented industrial capacity that could have doubled ammunition production. Germany was spending more defending against strategic bombing than the strategic bombing itself destroyed, and still losing both battles. September 11, 1944, 0830 hours. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Sassen. The morning briefing that day included a statistical analysis that reduced Germany's strategic situation to arithmetic. The report, compiled by Wehrmacht operations staff, documented American bombing operations for August, 27 days of major raids involving more than 500 bombers each, total of 19,400 bomber sorties dropping 61,000 tons of explosives. For comparison, Germany's entire strategic bomber force in 1940 had been approximately 1,200 aircraft total. The Americans were now launching that many bombers in 2 days. Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpff, recently appointed Chief of the General Staff, reviewed these figures with the understanding of a military professional who recognized when mathematics had rendered further resistance meaningless. "We are fighting arithmetic," he stated to the assembled officers. The Americans have transformed warfare into an industrial equation we cannot solve. They produce more, transport more, bomb more, and absorb losses more effectively than our entire military-industrial system can counter. The human cost of this industrial warfare had become staggering. Luftwaffe fighter pilot losses for August totaled 1,066 pilots killed or missing, the equivalent of losing the entire operational fighter pilot corps twice over in 30 days. Replacement pilots now received as little as 110 hours total flight time before combat deployment, compared to 240 hours in 1942. These undertrained pilots faced American bomber crews who were combat veterans flying in formations defended by experienced fighter escorts. The life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot in September 1944 was measured in missions, typically fewer than 5. But the most devastating revelation came from interrogations of captured American aircrews. These prisoners talked freely about conditions at their English bases, inadvertently revealing details that German intelligence found almost incomprehensible. American bomber crews lived in heated barracks with regular hot meals, recreational facilities, and medical care that exceeded German civilian hospitals. They flew missions over Germany and returned to conditions better than most German citizens experienced. After completing 25 missions, if they survived, they were rotated home to America. This contrast revealed the fundamental disparity between the combatants. Germany was a nation fully mobilized for survival, rationing every resource, converting civilian industries to war production, conscripting every available man. The United States was conducting history's largest military campaign while maintaining civilian living standards that improved during wartime. American factories producing bombers to destroy German industry were simultaneously producing consumer automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines. The United States was fighting a total war without total mobilization, and winning. The September statistics compiled by Luftwaffe intelligence documented the complete hopelessness of air defense. American bomber losses for the month: 432 aircraft destroyed, a number that would have been celebrated as decisive victory in 1943. But American bomber strength over Europe had actually increased by 183 aircraft during the same period. The replacement rate exceeded the loss rate by 42%. Germany was winning tactical battles while losing the strategic war by mathematics that could not be overcome. Reichsmarschall Göring, in a private meeting with senior Luftwaffe commanders on September 25, acknowledged what had become undeniable. April 25, 1945, 1,430 hours. A makeshift command post in the ruins of what had once been Luftwaffe headquarters outside Munich. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl sat across from General der Fleet Karl Kohler, the Luftwaffe's last chief of staff, reviewing documents that would never be filed, reports that no longer mattered. Outside, they could hear American artillery in the distance. The war had perhaps 2 weeks remaining. Kohler had spent the previous night compiling final statistics, a professional habit that persisted even as the Reich collapsed around them. The numbers told a story of industrial annihilation so complete that it redefined what defeat meant in modern warfare. From January 1944 through April 1945, American bombers had flown approximately 340,000 individual bomber sorties over occupied Europe. The 8th Air Force alone had dropped 692,918 tons of bombs on German targets. The 15th Air Force added another 303,842 tons. Total, nearly 1 million tons of explosives delivered by American heavy bombers, not counting medium bombers, fighter bombers, or British operations. German production statistics, meticulously maintained even during collapse, revealed the economic catastrophe. Aircraft production, which had reached 3,538 planes in September 1944 despite constant bombing, had fallen to 1,104 in March 1945. Tank production dropped from 1,669 in December 1944 to 385 in March 1945. Ammunition production had declined 74% from its 1944 peak. Synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of mobile warfare, had been reduced from 316,000 tons monthly in May 1944 to effectively zero by March 1945. But Jodl understood that the true accounting went beyond statistics. The Americans had demonstrated a form of warfare that Germany's military tradition could not comprehend. They had taken the concept of attrition, which Germany had always sought to avoid through tactical brilliance and operational art, and turned it into a strategic weapon of overwhelming power. The Americans had accepted that they would lose thousands of bombers and tens of thousands of airmen. They had calculated these losses as acceptable costs in an equation where their industrial capacity ensured eventual victory regardless of tactical outcomes. Kohler pulled out a final document, a captured American logistics report found in a shot-down bomber. It detailed the supply chain supporting a single heavy bomber group, 300 ground personnel supporting 30 bombers, requiring 12 tons of supplies daily, consuming 60,000 gallons of aviation fuel weekly, expending 150,000 rounds of ammunition monthly. And this was just one group. The Americans had deployed 40 such groups to Europe. The logistics alone, the unglamorous calculation of fuel tonnage and spare parts and replacement crews, represented industrial capacity that Germany could never match. "We prepared to fight a war," Jodl said quietly, closing the report. "They prepared to win one. We thought courage and tactical skill would matter. They proved that industrial capacity decides modern wars before the first shot is fired." He stood, looking at the documents that chronicled Germany's defeat not through any single battle, but through the relentless arithmetic of production numbers that had doomed the Reich from the moment America entered the conflict. May 8, 1945, 2,301 hours. The unconditional surrender had been signed hours earlier. In American air bases across England, ground crews were already beginning the massive task of standing down the largest air armada ever assembled. The final statistics were being compiled by U.S. strategic air forces in Europe: 2,680,000 bomber and fighter sorties flown, 2,770,540 tons of bombs dropped, 350,000 personnel deployed at peak strength. The 8th Air Force alone had become larger than the entire U.S. Army Air Forces had been in 1939. German military officers, now prisoners awaiting interrogation, were being questioned about their understanding of American capabilities. The transcripts, preserved in U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey archives, revealed a consistent theme. Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpff, who had watched those first massive formations in August 1943, told his interrogators, "We understood that America had industrial capacity. What we failed to understand was that they would apply that capacity with absolute ruthlessness. They built bombers knowing thousands would be destroyed. They trained aircrews knowing thousands would die. They calculated these losses and continued anyway because their production exceeded their losses. This was not warfare as we understood it. This was industrial mathematics applied to human conflict." The comparison was stark and undeniable. Germany had entered the war with the world's most experienced air force and the most advanced tactical aviation doctrine. The Luftwaffe of 1940 was arguably the most effective air force ever fielded up to that point. But German industry, even when supplemented by conquered territories and slave labor, produced 119,307 aircraft of all types during the entire war. American factories produced 324,750 aircraft, nearly 3 times as many. Of these, 34,348 were heavy bombers, a category Germany barely attempted to produce in equivalent numbers. The quality of individual aircraft and crews became irrelevant when quantity reached certain thresholds. A German Me-262 jet fighter was technologically superior to any Allied aircraft, but Germany produced fewer than 1,400 operational jets during the entire war. They appeared too late and in too few numbers to affect outcomes determined by thousands of conventional bombers that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, awaiting trial at Nuremberg, provided perhaps the most candid assessment during interrogation: "I knew from captured intelligence that America had enormous production capacity. But knowing it intellectually and seeing 2,000 bombers overhead daily are different experiences. The first time I saw reports of 1,000 bomber raids, I thought our intelligence was defective, that they were counting the same aircraft multiple times. When I realized the reports were accurate, I understood we had lost the war. You cannot defeat an enemy who can lose 100 bombers and return the next day with 1,000. The mathematics make victory impossible." The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness in destroying German industry remained debated among historians. But its psychological impact was unquestionable. The daily appearance of massive bomber formations demonstrated American power in the most visible possible way, proving to German military leaders, government officials, and civilians that resistance was futile against such overwhelming industrial might. The revelation that broke German confidence wasn't delivered in a single moment but accumulated across thousands of days, each morning bringing renewed proof that the war's outcome had been determined not by strategy or courage but by industrial arithmetic. General der Flieger Adolf Galland, writing in his post-war memoirs, described the transformation. By 1944, we no longer believed we could win. We fought because we were soldiers, because our cities were being destroyed, because surrender seemed impossible. But every morning, when those bomber formations appeared, we saw the future. It was written in aluminum and high explosive across the sky. The German general's realization, the moment when abstract knowledge became unbearable truth, occurred individually but followed a pattern documented in captured communications and post-war testimonies. First came disbelief at American production numbers. Then came hope that quality would overcome quantity, that German tactical skill would matter. Then came the grinding awareness that in modern industrial warfare, numerical superiority beyond certain thresholds renders individual skill irrelevant. Finally came the acceptance that Germany had entered a war it could not win against an opponent whose factories had already decided the outcome before significant combat began. The strategic bombing campaign represented more than tactical destruction. It was a daily, visible demonstration of American industrial power that no propaganda could explain away. German civilians looked up and counted bombers. German soldiers on every front heard reports of the raids. German industrial workers labored to repair factories that would be bombed again tomorrow. The psychological impact was perhaps more decisive than the physical damage. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, testified at Nuremberg that the bombing campaign's greatest effect was not the destruction itself but the constant disruption. We could repair factories, he explained. We could relocate production underground. What we could not overcome was the daily disruption of transportation, the constant diversion of resources to air defense, the impossibility of planning when we knew American bombers would return tomorrow. They forced us to spend enormous energy simply responding to their attacks, energy that should have gone toward production. The final truth was inescapable: Germany had prepared to fight a war of tactical brilliance and operational excellence. America had prepared to fight a war of industrial attrition. When these two philosophies collided, production capacity determined the outcome. The 2,000 American bombers that appeared over Germany daily were not just weapons. They were flying proof that the Reich faced an opponent whose industrial might was so vast that German resistance, no matter how courageous or skilled, could only delay defeat, never prevent it. The generals who had planned Germany's conquests based on tactical superiority and operational art learned that modern warfare's ultimate weapon was not brilliant strategy but overwhelming industrial capacity applied with mechanical persistence. The Americans had turned war into a production problem, and they had solved it with assembly lines that outbuilt anything Germany could destroy. The bombers overhead each day were not coming to defeat Germany. They were proof that Germany had already been defeated by factories in Michigan and Seattle, by production lines that had determined the war's outcome before the first bomb fell. The streams of bombers that darkened German skies didn't just deliver explosives. They delivered an unmistakable message written in aluminum and aviation fuel: industrial capacity, not tactical brilliance, decides modern wars. The German generals who had conquered Europe through operational excellence discovered that excellence meant nothing against an opponent who could lose today's battle and return tomorrow with forces larger than yesterday. What began with 64 bombers over Wilhelmshaven in January 1943 ended with daily raids of 2,000 aircraft that turned German resistance into a mathematical impossibility. The realization that courage and skill could not overcome industrial arithmetic broke something fundamental in German strategic thinking. They had prepared for the war they wanted to fight. America fought the war its factories had already won. If this story of industrial might overcoming military tradition resonated with you, there are dozens more untold stories from history's conflicts waiting to be explored. Subscribe now so you never miss these deep dives into the moments that changed warfare forever. Hit that like button if you learned something new today about how production lines can be as decisive as front lines. And drop a comment telling us, what other seemingly impossible military achievements should we cover next? Tomorrow, we're revealing another story of technological transformation that changed everything, and you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, in the arithmetic of modern war, the side with more factories writes the final equation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.